Minister John Swinney is urging Scots not to travel to England for New Year's Eve amid more relaxed COVID rules south of the border. Christine Jardine, Liberal Democrat MP for Edinburgh West, believes UK-wide governments should have joined forces from the start.
We should have had from the beginning in this, I believe, is that we should have had a much more concerted, more cooperative, four nations approach. The United Kingdom government should have been, if you like, setting the benchmarks, and we should have had local responses to what was happening. Instead of which we have this confusion about the UK government saying one thing and then the Scottish government saying another.
Lateral flow test shortages are a huge problem, with requests every 5 minutes over Christmas, according to some industry bosses. The Association of Independent Multiple Pharmacies has warned of patchy supplies of the rapid COVID tests following a change in self-isolation rules. They claim demand has increased since people can leave isolation after 7 days instead of 10 if they test negative. They say the daily influx of nearly 9,000 kits is not meeting demand. Elsewhere this morning, policing insulate Britain's road-blocking protests costs taxpayers at least £4.3 million. The group blocked motorways between September and November, calling on the government to cut carbon emissions by insulating UK homes. Metropolitan Police spent the bulk of the money, with over 6,600 officers and staff dealing with the campaigners. Transport Secretary Grant Shapps said he was appalled by the bill. The social care system is not fit for purpose and is handing some children over to criminal gangs, according to a new report. The Commission on Young Lives says many teenagers are moved away from where they live and sometimes end up in areas with high levels of crime. Criminal gangs have also been tipped off when vulnerable teens are moved into unregulated accommodation. The report said social care was failing to identify children at risk of exploitation early enough. Former Children's Commissioner for England and chair of the report, Anne Longfield, told GB News more needs to be done.
What we've got is, in all kind of essence, an epidemic of teenagers that are coming to harm. They're being exploited, they're being targeted by gangs and those that wish to involve them in violence. I'd like a new teenagers' social care system, if you like. I'd like it to really concentrate on understanding and recognising when teenagers were at harm early and working with those families to wrap support around those families. We need a kind of ring of protection for those kids.
An economic think tank is warning that millions of families face a cost of living catastrophe in 2022. The Resolution Foundation says that from next April, families will be £1,200 a year worse off due to soaring energy bills and an increase in national insurance contributions. At the same time, rising inflation means that real pay levels will stay the same. A Merseyside police officer has been sacked for gross misconduct after reportedly taking selfies at a murder scene while on duty. PC Ryan Connolly took photos of himself whilst guarding the cordon in 2018. He also had homophobic, racist and offensive images on his phone. Deputy Chief Constable Ian Critchley said Connolly's actions were appalling and beyond comprehension. Prince Andrew's lawyer is arguing that Virginia Giuffre cannot sue the Prince in the US because she lives in Australia. Virginia Giuffre is suing the Queen's son for allegedly sexually assaulting her when she was a teenager. However, the Duke of York's lawyer has filed documents questioning the court's jurisdiction. Miss Giuffre claims she was trafficked by Jeffrey Epstein to have sex with the royal when she was 17. The Duke has denied all the allegations. And finally, the Royal Mint has unveiled 2 new coins to celebrate the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. The 50p coin is the first of its kind to recognise a royal event, whilst the £5 coin follows the tradition of marking previous jubilees on crown pieces. They're the first collector's items to be released in memory of the Queen's 70-year reign. You're up to date with the latest news. We'll have more for you in an hour.
Hi there, Colin Brazier with you through until 2 p.m. today. Let's kick off with this story. The cabinet of the SNP-led government in Scotland is, we think, meeting pretty much about now, ahead of a session of the Scottish Parliament at Holyrood. It comes as Nicola Sturgeon faces criticism for taking what some see as an excessively draconian approach to Omicron. that risks making it impossible for struggling Scots businesses to survive. Well, it's reported that the First Minister may announce a shortening of the self-isolation period in Scotland to fall into line with the 7-day quarantine required in England. COVID cases in Scotland are on the up. Numbers in Scotland, for instance, they rose by 11,000 on Boxing Day. But according to the latest data, hospitalisations, we keep being reminded they are the key metric in all this, are not rising quite so sharply, at least not yet. Well, the SNP's tough line on restrictions, including the cancellation of large gatherings for Hogmanay, has prompted some speculation that thousands of Scots will travel across the border to welcome in the new year. Well, in a moment, we'll discuss how the rest of the UK is coping with COVID in these days between Christmas and the new year. But first, we can turn to our Scotland correspondent, Davy Donaldson, for where we are in Scotland on those restrictions. Davy, very good day to you. Just remind us of the restrictions as they currently stand.
Yeah, Colin, the restrictions as they currently stand is for regards to hospitality. You're allowed 100 people standing, 200 people seated, outdoor events up to 500 people. Within the hospitality, within pubs and restaurants, it's going to be 3 table service, and it's going to be just from 3 households. So those are the restrictions as they stand at the moment. Obviously, the sporting events, we've got the Championship and League 1 and League 2 in Scotland, the football, that's up to 500 supporters allowed in there. But obviously, the big events like Hogmanay has been cancelled, and understandably so, given the numbers that we've seen. You talked there about Nicola Sturgeon maybe taking a draconian approach. I think that's a lot of people view it that way, especially when you see what's happening in England or what's not happening in England. And certainly you would expect people from Scotland to travel south to England to enjoy New Year. Obviously, that's something Nicola Sturgeon doesn't want to happen, but I'm pretty sure it will.
So often it seemed, Davy, hasn't it, that Nicola Sturgeon's led the way and then England has followed suit. It just begins to look, perhaps, this might be an instance where the opposite holds true.
Perhaps, but then you see what's happening in Northern Ireland and Wales as well, and a lot of people here are starting to think, well, hang on a second, why are England not doing as much as they possibly could to prevent the spread of Omicron? I know the hospital cases, as you said there, the figures are not particularly high in terms of hospital admissions, but certainly there's a feeling in Scotland that, why are we having to endure this when England are not doing anything really in terms of, nothing till after New Year? So it certainly feels like one rule for one rule for another for a lot of people here. I think today, this afternoon, Nicola Sturgeon will probably not change the restrictions. I think that's the feeling. Humza Yousaf, the health minister, has come out and said that health restrictions would probably not be changed in terms of the restrictions put in place for COVID-19, but it's being reviewed daily, and certainly there's a meeting happening as we speak. So it's not to say that they won't change. I think, though, it's highly unlikely that they will.
David, just give us a bit of context, if you can, not just about COVID in Scotland, but the state of the health service in Scotland. I'm going to be talking to Claire Muldoon, who knows a lot about this, in just a second. But we've reported over the past couple of months, situation with A&E, dire in parts of the Central Belt. You've got the army called in. Is there a sense in which perhaps the SNP have to behave slightly differently because there are problems there that are particularly acute, that mean they are exacerbated by COVID, and the situation is different because there is a kind of crisis that Scotland faces?
Yeah, obviously the Omicron virus has had a huge bearing on it in terms of staff numbers. A lot of people, because it spreads quicker, a lot of people have been off. So that's obviously put the NHS in Scotland at a breaking point. As you say, they're called in the army to try and help out as well, which is, again, a really desperate measure, but one they've obviously, the SNP have decided that they needed to do. The Scottish Government have decided to go down that route, and it's probably out of necessity rather through a choice. But, obviously hospital waiting times is another huge issue in Scotland as well. We've heard from the Liberal Democrats earlier in the week, they were talking about the waiting times for people suffering from mental health, young people, up to 2 years. So you can see there's a whole raft of problems in Scotland in terms of the health service. This has obviously been caused, and certainly made it even worse by Omicron and the spread of COVID-19. What they do about that, I don't know, is the answer, because obviously this is going to go on and on and on until we stop getting new variants or we find boosters that actually work. So I'm not really sure what the answer is to that, but certainly it's been a huge problem in Scotland.
David, thanks ever so much. David Donaldson there. I mentioned Claire Muldoon, who's got some experience of the health service. She's here with me in the studio now. Claire, thanks for coming in. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
What do you make of the way the SNP under Nicola Sturgeon have handled COVID so far?
Well, it's interesting because the polls would suggest that the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has done a sterling job in terms of communication, in terms of rallying her troops, in terms of dealing with the population of Scotland and driving them into, obviously, the mecca is, COVID-free, but she's not managed that. Now, something very interesting has happened. There has been a turn over this Christmas festive period. And I think she, whereby beforehand, where she was always a few steps ahead of Prime Minister Johnson, she's now back-footing it, possibly, given the fact that the data doesn't stack, the evidence doesn't stack, and the compliance...
Data's not in, is it?
And
Data's
no,
not...
it's not. And that's why it's very difficult and quite wrong of mainstream media to actually keep banging on about these 11,000 cases on Boxing Day. That was an estimate. The definites are not there. Public Health Scotland have not given any note at all about the cases going there.
And the key thing, I remember talking to Carol Sikora, eminent oncologist, about this 3 or 4 weeks ago, and he was saying, look, the key figure every single day, you've got to look for the hospitalisation figure. 4 p.m, set your watches. That's in England.
But Colin, it's not even hospital admissions, it's hospital admissions through COVID, through Omicron.
And
I'm afraid not incidentally, we don't have those and we don't have that information. So I think it's incredibly foolhardy of the First Minister of Scotland to come out and impose draconian measures from Boxing Day going forward.
Is it though? I mean, the precautionary principle says, until you're sure, take no chances. That's got to be the argument.
Look, Colin, the South African variant, of which we're battling now, Omicron, was the global epicentre for the go-to in terms of dealing with it globally and how the rest of the countries were dealing with lockdowns, with compliance, with data. There's been a 38% decrease now in cases in South Africa. Is that not something we should be looking towards now when we were looking to that data at the very beginning of Omicron? Something doesn't stack up. And when she gives, the First Minister, when she gives her address at 2 o'clock at Holyrood, I would urge the Scottish mainstream media to ask her questions, to question her completely on it. Yeah. Has she, for instance, negotiated or chatted to the Chamber of Commerce for businesses in Scotland? They have come out publicly and asked that Scotland at least look to England in terms of forms of guidance. I think it's appalling that she has managed to rail through these draconian efforts for the NHS in Scotland as well, but moreover, the 10-day isolation key. And I think that's key to opening up workers, workforce and the movement of labour therein.
Numbers tell a story, statistics tell a story, don't they? But so do images. And if we see images on New Year's Eve of convoys of cars heading south on the 74 through the Scottish borders to Carlisle, to Berwick-upon-Tweed, the trains packed to Newcastle, revellers heading south. That will tell a story.
Well, it will only tell a story, and we can only have that story told if that's what happens. She might very well turn around today and change the regulations, change the restrictions, and allow people to revel in Edinburgh, Glasgow, the main cities that you've said. I would suggest, however, that there wouldn't be that many tickets bought, purchased, reserved to come down south of the border, because I think it's fueling the rhetoric of something happening, and I think it's fueling the rhetoric not only against the SNP, but actually what is going on, can we catch it, and therefore QED, what is the point?
So just to recap, as far as you're concerned, you don't expect to see anything dramatic happen at 2 o'clock?
I don't. Well, who knows? I'm completely torn in this. For the first time, my gut doesn't know which way to go. And I'm really surprised at that because she has surprised me consistently throughout her first ministerial career in Scotland. I just wish it would come to a speedy end. However, that's not for me to vote because being a Scot living in London, I'm not even allowed to vote. But that's another story.
You'll be delighted about that. Claire, thanks very much. Claire Muldoon. That's it from me for this hour. Join me again at 11 discussing there whether England should follow the American lead and reduce the COVID isolation period to 5 days as opposed to 7. First, though, time for the weather.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
GBviews@gbnews.com.